How I got here, just put the cards on the table. I wrote a book not long ago called Global Grassroots, Perspectives on International Organizing, and a website was having a discussion of the book, and it was one of those webinar things where people type the questions and type the answers. It's a very peculiar experience, actually, but you're all of a sudden having all these questions fly at you, and there are some questions from some unknown person that started flying out about some remote community in California. And finally, to get this person to, let other people ask questions, let us get back to the book, I said, get in touch with me later, here's my email address. And that turned out to be Al, who we talked in a number of times, and I told him, I was going to be in Northern California for a number of meetings sometime in the summer, and I actually knew where the Morro Bay area was, because in 1968, I drove with my wife at the time through for 2.5 months up the coast, camping, and camped at Morro Bay State Park. I said, well, that's a beautiful area. How could anybody not care about that area? And I remembered it as being close to the Bay Area, and 3.5 hours, that's not bad. I'm from San Jose. So the long and short of it is, I said I'd be glad to come talk about the kind of work Acorn did, the kind of work I know something about, which is citizen wealth. And that had to do with this other book that I wrote a couple of years ago, right after I left Acorn in 2009. And that fit in, hey, how are you doing?
Good, thanks.
That fit in more with, when I talk about citizen wealth, I'm really talking about income security. And that's the whole range of things, from what makes, for working families, which is who I mainly deal with, low to moderate income families, the key indicator of economic security tends to be your home if you own it. That was certainly true when I wrote the book, and Acorn had a long experience from the passage of something called the Community Reinvestment Act in 1978, enforcing loan money to go into lower income communities to finance home ownership, home repair. In writing that book, I was able to calculate that there were some 10 million families that were able to buy houses, of whom almost half of them came through agreements that Acorn negotiated with various large banks. Part of the problem, though, as you know now, is that in 2007, when I was still with Acorn, I left in 2008, 4 years ago, we were negotiating with a lot of these subprime banks. New Century, Citibank, Wells Fargo, all of them. And you'd have these conversations about their loan portfolio, and you'd say, these stated income loans, do you realize half of your portfolio is stated income loans? You know what a stated income loan would be? It means that instead of you showing your W-2 or your tax form, you're essentially saying that your income adds up to X.
A verbal commitment. Huh?
Well, yeah, except that sometimes it wasn't your verbal commitment. It was the broker saying that's what you own, because we ran into a lot of families were getting these loans who are on, limited income, Social Security, etc., who were shocked to hear that they were making $50,000 a year.
Some people call that liar's loans.
A lot of people call it liar's loans now, and we understood that there were a reason for stated income. If you were a tipped employee, a server in a restaurant or a bellman in a New Orleans hotel, you might be making a good income, but so much of it was on tips, you'd need another way to establish what your income is to ever be able to buy a house. So many of our members, we could understand a stated income, but not when half of your loan portfolio, $7 billion a month out of New Century, was stated income. They had to know that there was a problem. And what they would always tell us in the negotiations was, and you've probably read this now, no, our algorithm, we have excellent algorithms that calculate for all risk, it's no problem. Well, the last time I negotiated with them, they were, out of business 6 months later, and the whole subprime market doesn't exist anymore, and we know what the housing crisis is like. what that meant is 20 to 30 years of gains in terms of citizen wealth for working families has been wiped out now, particularly among African American and Latino households. So that the average income for African Americans, the average citizen wealth now in this economy is less than $1,000 is what their wealth is. So when we talk about, and you've read this, you know, everybody in America is now only 2 paychecks away from homelessness. Well, the truth is, if you're in some categories, you're less than 2 paychecks away because now what you might have owned doesn't have the same value anymore. But housing is important. We did a lot of campaigns around what we call living wages, trying to increase wages so that people were able to get, these were working people, but instead of making them the federal minimum wage, which hadn't changed in 7, 8 years, we were able to win area wages in many communities. San Francisco is one. Here in California, you all have the opportunity to create wages based on areas. Most of that hasn't happened, but it did happen in San Francisco. But it also happened in New Orleans, Santa Fe, a number of communities. In places statewide where we were able to raise the state minimum wage in places like Florida and Colorado, Ohio, Arizona to $1 or $2 above the federal minimum, when those elections had their votes counted, it meant 200,000 or 300,000 people received a raise of $1,000, $2,000 a year. So you had huge benefits that were worth, in Florida, almost $2 billion the year it was passed. This made a lot of difference. So now I work a lot outside of the country. In Canada is sort of like a colder US, so that's like the United States, but many of the areas where I work are in mega slums now, outside of Mexico City, in India, in Nairobi, places like that, where what's interesting is that these same kinds of issues exist, but there it's more about survival. How do you get drinking water? How do you get access to education? How do you get any shelter, much less a shelter you could say is part of income security? But all of these issues in some ways are related to the degree that you can't make progress unless you can come together with people in the same situation, address what those issues are, listen to each other, find that maybe to your surprise they have the same issue you have, and make a plan to move forward. Which almost brings me around the circle to when Al first reached out to me, is this has been a community that's had a long history of trying to deal with some fairly big issues that in some ways are much larger than the community itself. Bill and I were talking a minute ago. I was in Pittsburgh about 2.5 months ago and sort of stumbled on an issue almost exactly like the one you're facing, except in scale. There's a proposal to build a 50-foot in diameter tunnel under the, anybody ever been to Pittsburgh? Well, you know, it's got 3 rivers, yep. Right? 3 River Stadium, you know. They want to build essentially a wastewater discharge system in a tunnel under the 3 rivers. And there are 70-odd communities that'll all be assessed the cost because they're in the watershed for this gray water and wastewater, and it's the same exact thing. EPA compliance with groundwater and wastewater combination in an old sewer system. In that case, that's a different situation than yours, but a $4 or $5 billion project, and they're looking at bills if this all comes to fruition. That would be $200, $250 a month for the next 20 years. Well, you know, Pittsburgh's Pittsburgh. There's, you know, people living on top of the hill are doing great, but most of it, it's those are working communities all throughout that. In this economy or any other, nobody's necessarily got an extra $3,000 or $4,000 they put aside to pay for their sewer bill. So what do you do about these problems? In New Orleans, 10 years ago, we had a long fight for exactly this kind of issue where they wanted to privatize the sewer and water system because they believed if they privatized it, they could attract bonding money that would allow them to refinance the infrastructure improvements on the sewer system. So we were able to stop that from happening by one vote, and then they had this little storm called Katrina. You may have heard about it, and now they're having to do a lot of things to the sewer system. So essentially we've got a delay because we're having to fix it back to the broken place it was before we can really deal with the EPA problem. I say all that to say this. I mean, out here in your community, you may think, well, this is just us, but it actually, my count, I talked to a guy in Pittsburgh who counted more than 800 communities at that time and thought it was more than 1,000 that faced exactly these same kinds of problems. Very small communities like yours, 15,000, whatever you have lived there, to big cities like New Orleans. Portland just decided on its own to go ahead and pay for the system because they have more resources. New Orleans, Atlanta, you could make a list. It really is all over the country. But nobody is really putting together a plan, and part of that has to do with, if you read all the discussion, the transfer of what used to be public cost to private citizens is part of what we see in a disaster like Katrina, frankly, where in the sort of Bush think, which a lot of people talk about as neoliberalism, what's been going on in terms of how people view government is they believe the least government possible is the best government. So you've had a draining of resources and responsibility for people seeing public goods as being paid for by a collective sense of the public, which is why all the costs get transferred to individuals regardless. It's like a regressive tax. Regardless of your inability to pay, you have to pay the same in Pittsburgh, $250 potentially for your sewer system. Or, I mean, I don't know what it may cost here when you all face up to it, but it may be somewhere in that neighborhood, 150, 200, 250, who can tell? But these are all of a sudden individually borne costs that people aren't necessarily able to deal with. You do have some things that are different here, but so when Al started talking to me, actually I just heard about that in Pittsburgh. We've seen that in New Orleans. This is actually happening all over the country. I'd like to hear more of what y'all are doing, learn if there's different strategies y'all have come up with, and maybe just have a dialogue about what might be possible. I think I've been listening to people for the last 3 or 4 hours since I drove over from San Jose this morning, but so maybe there's some ideas, but all of this, in my view, has to do with what builds good communities, what builds income security, and what builds the kind of quality of life as people here in the U.S. we think that we have a right to. So if you were looking for, those of you who heard music, we had some great music. I appreciate that drawing the crowd, complete with their own sound system. I hope people can hear me.
You're fine.
But if you expected a long lecture and, all this kind of stuff, that's really not me. I've been an organizer for over 40 years. An organizer basically learns how to listen, not speak so much. So I can actually put a sentence together, but a lot of what I learn is by listening to other people and by the questions and answers that come up here. So I'd like to just throw it open, if that's fair, and see what we can come up with. And I appreciate all of you for coming.